wa barakatuh. Welcome to our online discussions looking at the Blessed Prophet and the transformation of the Arabian community to which he came. Obviously, I would like to take this opportunity to congratulate one and all on the anniversary of the birth of our Blessed Prophet. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala shower him with endless blessings and salutations and shower his immaculate progeny with blessings and salutations. The format for this evening is that I shall put a series of questions to our panelists with the hope that they will develop into healthy discussions and, of course, informative discussions and maybe healthy debate. So without further ado, let me introduce our guests for this evening. We have with us Dr. Ayman Yaqub from Birmingham, Dr. Mahjabin Dala from California, and our own Dr. Imran Ali Panjwani from Chelmsford. We are hoping that Dr. Rebecca Masterton will join us in due course of time. I will begin with the first question. The Quran states, reminding the Muslims about the favors of Allah, and it states, وَاعْتَصِمُوا بِحَبْلِ اللَّهِ جَمِيعًا وَلَا تَفَرَّقُوا واذكروا نعمة الله عليكم إذ كنتم أعداء فألف بين قلوبكم فأصبحتم بنعمته إخوانا. And bring to mind the blessings of Allah upon you when you are enemies, and He brought love within your hearts, and through His favors you became brothers. After that, the verse says, وَكُنْتُمْ عَلَى شَفَا حُفْرَةٍ مِّنَ النَّارِ فَأَنْقَذَكُمْ مِنْهَا. And you are on the verge of falling within the pit of hell, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala saved you from it. Based on this, Dr. Ayman, could you tell us about the outlook and the worldview of the Jahiliyyah community to whom the Prophet went, so that we can get some perspective into the nature of that community, and of course it will give us a sense of appreciation of the achievement of the Blessed Prophet in so fully transforming that community. Dr. Ayman.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Alaykum salam wa rahmatullah.
Bismillah wa salatu wa salam ala rasulillah Sayyidina Muhammadin alayhi wa ala alihi afdal salati wa atammu taslim. Thumma amma ba'd. Talking about the, how the Arabs lived at the time of Jahiliyyah. Once this topic is brought up, I always remember something that no one would be able to put the words as eloquent as this person put them, talking about this transition between the time before the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam and afterwards. In the very famous speech that Sayyidina Ja'far ibn Abi Talib gave before Al-Najashi, the Negus, the king of Abyssinia, as we all know, when Sayyidina Ja'far ibn Abi Talib led the small group of the companions who migrated to Al-Habasha, to Abyssinia, in the first migration during the Muslims' time in Mecca. When Al-Najashi wanted to ask about this religion, because the delegation that arrived from Quraysh asking Al-Najashi to give them back those who deserted their religion and migrated to his country. So there was a very small window for Sayyidina Ja'far ibn Abi Talib to be able to deliver his message to Al-Najashi. So what he said, I say, that summarizes it all. So Sayyidina Ja'far ibn Abi Talib, he started before Al-Najashi, and he said to him in the very famous speech, كُنَّا قَوْمًا أَهْلَ جَاهِلِيَّةٍ. So he's giving, this is what we were at the time of Jahiliyyah. And he goes to the king and he says, O king, we were like people of ignorance and committing all sorts of abomination and shameful deeds. We were breaking the ties of kinship. We were treating guests badly, and the strong amongst us exploited the weak. And he talked about the time of Jahiliyyah, all this state of ignorance and immorality. And then he said, وَكُنَّا عَلَى هَذِهِ الْحَالِ, and we remained in this state until Allah sent us a prophet, one of our own people, whose lineage and truthfulness, trustworthiness and integrity were well known to all of us. And then he said, فَدَعَانَا إِلَى عِبَادَةِ اللَّهِ وَحْدَهُ. He called us to worship Allah alone and to renounce the stones and the idols. And then he said, he commended us to speak the truth, to honor our promises, to be kind to our relations, to be helpful to our neighbors, to cease all forbidden acts, to abstain from bloodshed, to avoid obscenities and false witness, not to appropriate an orphan's property, nor slander chaste women. And he kept going on and on about how the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam made this transition from what the situation was before Islam to after Islam. So Sayyidina Ja'far ibn Abi Talib, he was very eloquent, like the speech in Arabic is very beautiful. كنا قوما أهل جاهلية نعبد الأصنام ونسفك الدماء ويأكل القوي منا الضعيف. So he described the time of Jahiliyyah. If one of the reasons that the Arabs rejected the message of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam at the beginning was because he came to make some balance, but it wasn't for the like the interests of those who are in the position of leadership. And so, I mean, look, like, you know, the Arabs, for example, if you heard about, like, you know, the Harb Dahis wal Ghabra, just a war that lasted for at least 40 years. The reason was two horses racing, and one came, like, you know, before the other, and it started a war between two tribes that lasted for 40 years. Tens of thousands of people were killed because of this war. So that was, like, you know, the situation at that time. Just to be honest, I'm not saying the Arabs didn't have something to be proud of. No, they're like some noble people, and, like, you know, they were very eloquent, and, like, you know, poetry. They had their own way of living. But when it comes to the moral part, like, I mean, like a tribe would kill a whole tribe over, like, a well of water. You know.
So, Dr. Ayman,
Yes.
Thank you. So I'd like to move it on a little bit from where you have taken us, from where you have brought us. Dr. Majabin, in terms of their belief systems, the Quran in the Meccan verses does admonish the Arabs and say, can God ordain that which is indecent? Can God ordain the killing of children and sacrificing children to gods? It seems that they had this belief that the Quran talks about. And also, if you look at the smaller chapters, Quran often quotes them by saying that who will raise us after we have become decayed bones? What was their theology? What did they understand in terms of where they were going beyond life, in terms of their responsibility in life? How did they justify it all? How did they see it? Or were there many different types of beliefs coexisting?
So thank you for that question, and thank you for your reflection, Dr. Ayman. And I also want to just begin by saying an Eid Mubarak and a Milad Nabi Mubarak to all our viewers and everyone here. For me, when I look at the comparison between what Arabia was and the kind of transformative reform that the Prophet brought, for me, the basis of trying to understand that is from the sermon of Fadak, which is the sermon of Sayyidah Fatima. And she does this comparison between what Arabia was before and the blessing of the Prophet and the mercy of the Prophet, or the mercy of God through the Prophet, brought about a transformation in the society. And she makes a reference to the beliefs of the people in Arabia. And I believe that was the question that you raised, and what their beliefs were. I know that before I start on their beliefs, I think it's so important to know that because the Prophet was raised in that location of Arabia, we take that sort of belief apart and say, what were they pre-prophet and post-prophet? But when we do a sociological analysis of what the world was like at that time, and if we're thinking in anthropological terms, then what the world is now is maybe not very different from what it was then. But you find this core of a temporality of vision where people are just thinking of now and here, and everything that is out of sight is so mystical that you can just make any story out of it. So I think the Arabs, just like most of the people at that time, were people who were focused on their now and their might, and the world was for the person who possessed the power and the might. So their idea in bearing daughters alive or doing these things that they did, and the ayats that you pointed out that saying God would never want people to do something that is wrong. You could not use a theological license to perpetrate a kind of crime, which you find that the Arabian societies were doing at that time. So I think it came from the premise of, might and power and the temporality of their vision, because the women were looked upon as liabilities at that time. They chose to just bury the women and keep the men alive because they would bring in assets and they would bring in, material gain to their tribes. So they were not really, I think, thinking about the afterlife. They were thinking of here and now, and they were thinking of the power and the immediate power. We've read in books where their concept of the afterlife was really very loose. They sometimes believed that the human soul turned into a bird and flew away, and that was it. And I think the thing about Islam, or the message of the Prophet, that brought about the biggest shock to them was the accountability of what they were doing in this world. So the concept of you don't die with death, you just transition to another stage where you're going to be asked about or held accountable for the choices you made and the actions you did, was something really very horrific. And then you have the verses where you pointed out, where they said, who will bring us back to life when we've turned to dust and our bones have rotten? Who is going to bring us back? So I think that idea of life after death, and more so the accountability aspect of the life after death, was received with a lot of pushback from the Arabs at that time, and it sort of threatened their status quo of might, now, here, and who knows what happens to us when we go from here. I think it just threatened that safe zone that was working very well for the powerful people of the time, but not so quite well for the marginalized ones.
Thank you. It also appears that their theologies allowed for the strong to oppress the weak, and it was of sort justified through their belief systems, pretty much. And I do not mean to, of course, talk about any religion here, but pretty much like the caste system that we have in certain regions of India, the untouchables, who are quite content with their fate because it's been ordained and destined for them. There is somehow a justification through the belief system. Dr. Imran, building on this, we know that the community was uneducated. They were desert people. But at the same time, when we read the Quran, we find this sense that they were beholden to excessive ceremonies and superstitions that they had developed over the years. Can you talk us through some of those superstitions and how their belief systems were? What was it that was bringing about this obstacle in their mind from thinking?
Jazakallah
It's
Shaykh.
very heavy in saying think.
Yeah, Jazakallah Shaykh. I think there's two things. You mentioned, and the other brother and sister mentioned about, for example, caste system or elite system. I think that can exist in any religion, number one. I don't think it was necessarily linked to idol worship as such. It could occur within Islam, Christianity, Judaism, having an elite system or an elite group oppressing others. So to answer your question, I think that the idol worship did not point to any level of transcendence, any level where human potential could develop beyond what they saw, beyond the idol, beyond themselves, beyond Abu Sufyan, for example, whether it could be a rabbi, it could be a priest, could be whoever it is. Today it could be a sheikh, let's say, it doesn't really matter. The point is that the ethics of their belief did not allow them to see beyond their own positions. So to answer the first part, to answer your question, is that enabled them to oppress, number one. So I don't think that is necessarily linked to idol worship, but we can have discussion. Number two is the superstitions. I think from reading some of the hadith and also the sabab al-nuzul of this verse is that the Banu Aus and the Banu Khazraj were fighting for 120 years. And as Sheikh Ayman also mentioned, the superstitions or the small things which they fought over did not allow the society to develop. And one specific example of this is the poetry. So within the poetry, there was a lot of talk about the idols, for example, doing X and Y and Z for people, or that they will get money, they will get wealth. So their rituals, I think, were based around poetry, were based around worshipping Lat and Uzza, and making sure that their ceremonies revolved around a lot of earthly sort of gain, not anything beyond that. So the idols represented some earthly pleasure to them, perhaps, that they could have a balanced life by worshipping idols and going around the Kaaba, doing whatever they saw fit. So I think that I think there needs to be maybe more exploration as to how the fact that idol worship may not necessarily lead to oppression in society, that could be something else, but certainly it can lead to rituals relating to earthly goals rather than something more transcendental.
So, Dr. Majibin, I just want to come back to you with what Dr. Imran has said. Dr. Imran is making a point that idol worship is not the chief cause for exploitation or having ceremonies that are inconsistent with human growth and progression. Such a situation can very well occur within the folds of a monotheistic faith, let us say Islam or Christianity. If that is the case, then fundamentally, what do you think was wrong with that community that led to that state where exploitation was rife and the people were not progressing?
Well, I think it's not something very peculiar to that kind of a society, and that is also what I mentioned in my reflection, that maybe we're still living in those ignorant forms. It was not something that we're talking about pre-arrival of the Prophet. That could still be prevalent in our societies today. What could lead to that, one knows, is ignorance, people not knowing that they don't know, and also a kind of, even if there was some kind of intellectuality or some kind of critique of what was happening during those days and times, and as we know that before we want to dismantle any sort of a belief or we want to question any sort of a practice, we pose a question that puts that practice in doubt. And that's a very beautiful and intellectual attitude to be able to start a deconstruction process. But I think what was lacking then, and might also be lacking now, is that once we try to soar with this critique and questioning attitude, we don't find something that grounds us as we soar. So even though we're trying to fly and rise to a better level, if we don't have something that's grounding us, or giving us a position or a focus where we can come back, then that can just leave us astray, or we can just be floating in our thoughts. So I think what might be a problem even with theistic religions is that when we start our questioning attitudes, we lose the focus or the grounding aspect of our questions. And I think this was something very beautiful that was introduced by the Prophet in that kind of a society, and perhaps something that needs to be revisited in our kind of a society, is where we entertain questions and we delve into a critique, because I think that is where we can hold off of this kind of elitist thinking. And if we pose this critical thinking without a core that holds us down. So I believe the Prophet and the wilayah that comes with the Prophet is key to grounding us while we also move ahead in critiquing what has been built around that kind of a questioning attitude. So for me, I think that is what was missing then. And the Prophet introduced that questioning, that critique of their practices, that critique of their values, the critique of their theology, if they had one at that time. And at the same time, kept them grounded to the transcendent and the human connection with the transcendent.
Thank you.
I think that is, yeah.
Thank you. That brings me, obviously, naturally leads us on to the next question, that the Prophet began his missionary role by introducing God at the helm of a human's life, at the helm of their universe, making them feel accountable. But at the same time, the Prophet was brutally critical of the Arabian cultures to the extent that he was seen as being offensive, and we can see that from the Quran itself. Now, the Quran states that he is the one who ordains good, prohibits evil, makes lawful what is good, makes prohibited what is unwholesome, and thereby he lifts the shackles, or thereby he lifts the weights that pin them to the ground and breaks their shackles that bind them, in order to say that the Prophet, through this endeavor, liberates them. Dr. Ayman, the Prophet has two parts to his life as a prophet who is preaching to a community, the Meccan phase and the Madinian phase. In Mecca, he is not the head of a community, nor does he become the head of a state. There is no organized faith. In Mecca, he is with a community of people who are scattered. What was the nature of his preaching in Mecca that subsequently set the ground for him to establish a community and to form a faith? Basically, what I'm asking here is that is there a sense within the Islamic teachings of essence and form, that in Mecca he delivers the essence of what he is all about, whereas in Medina he formulates it? So we turn to Hussein Nasser here. Hussein Nasser says in one of his works that what the Blessed Prophet did was he turned the people inward, gave them a belonging with God. And the Meccan verses are heavy on purification of the soul, on reflection, on questioning and critique. Dr. Ayman, what were the essential teachings that the Prophet imparted to his community in the Meccan phase?
I mean, this distinction, Quran made it clear through even the way it was revealed. Like, that's why in the science of Quran, in Ulum al-Quran, we have what we call, like, the Makki and the Madani. And one of the key things that you would understand that this verse is revealed in Mecca or revealed in Medina is the message in the verse. Like what this verse is talking about. It determines whether this verse was revealed in Mecca or was revealed in Medina. That's one of the things. So Quran, in the verses that were revealed in Mecca, he shows us the essence of the message of Islam and what the principles that the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ laid out during his life in Mecca. And just to link a point that was mentioned to what I'm going to talk, to say right now, like the idea about like idol worshipping that was there, whether it was something leading the community at that time or whether it was an outcome of something else that was bigger, it's actually very good because it leads to how the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ dealt with it. And from my own understanding, I believe that worshipping idols was an outcome of something bigger. It wasn't something driving something else. By this I mean, when we look at the way they worshipped idols, if they lose a war, for example, the head of the tribe comes, destroys the idol and says, like, you haven't helped me in any way, builds a new one, give it, and then they will give it a new name. So we see that the belief system that they had wasn't strong. It wasn't the thing that was driving them. That's why they could easily change their gods and give them new name. So the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam came, as you Sheikh Arif mentioned, and he worked his whole stay in Mecca as a prophet, those 13 years after the revelation of the message, to change this, to make their belief system is the thing that is driving the people. They are not the ones driving it. We see this when the like the people of Quraysh pushed through Abu Talib, that if the Prophet is doing this because of money, then we would give him. Yeah, because that shows us the way they think. They think the belief system is just let's say a mean to something else. It's not the source. It's just a mean to something. So they thought, okay, if he wants this, we will give him. If he wants that, we will give him that. So the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam worked on changing all of this, and he laid out during his time in Mecca that the essence of the message that he wants during Mecca is that we believe in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He is like nothing else. And it is something that he planted inside the hearts of the people over there. They made everything that they do is based on that belief. It's what leads them. I believe this is the biggest change that the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam planted. That what led, at the beginning, they said only those who are oppressed follow him, which means that he offered them something that the system that's in place cannot offer them. But that wasn't it, because afterwards you see heads of tribes following him. So what, and then that changed everything. Those 13 years, what the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam did in the 13 years was at-tawheed, establishing the oneness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, one thing that they can cling to. Talking about the superstition that the Arabs had, I mean, they had so many different ways that I can see they consider this to be God. So for example, they will hold the bird, yeah, if they are about to go into war or about to make a big decision, and then they'll just let it free to fly. If it goes right, then they go on with whatever they were planning. If it goes left, then they just give up on it. That's because Arabs wanted to cling to something. The idea of God for them wasn't clear. Is it a statue that I build? Is it a bird that I let fly? Is it at Al-Kaaba, when they would have something like some sort of like a gambling, and they have like the arrows and the things, and Al-Azlam wal-Ansab around Kaaba. So the belief system wasn't clear to the people. So this is what the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam established. He purified all of this. He made it into one solid thing, the oneness, the tawheed. I believe that's what the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam worked in the 13 years in Mecca.
Thank you, Dr. Ayman. So I would just like to repeat some of the things that you have said and maybe add on that fundamentally the Prophet introduced God at the helm of their existence. And God was the pinnacle of where their humanity ought to be and arrive at. He was a principle of all goodness. At the same time, when we look at the Meccan verses, it instills within them a sense of responsibility and accountability. It also invites them to think, to question. It intellectually liberated them. And I think that might be the key for them to come out of this superstitious state and gain confidence in their own ability. Because if God is introduced in place of idols, then inevitably the Prophet is saying to them, have confidence in your own abilities, trust in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And of course, the whole emphasis within Makkah of purification of the soul from greed, to care for the other, to give to the miskin and give to the yatim, so on and so forth. So that purification was a spiritual and moral purification. Introduction of God at the spiritual level, care for the other at a moral level, and generally to bring about virtues within their souls and refinement of their morals and their whole beings. Now, if that's the case, and if we agree on that, then I want to move on to the next discussion, because we've got quite a few points to discuss today. Dr. Imran, in Makkah, giving was voluntary, like zakat. Purify yourself from greed by showing care for the other. Praying was very voluntary and minimalistic. In Medina, you find the creation of an identity of a Muslim community. Prayers being institutionalized at 5 proper times, whereas in Makkah they were at 2 times or maximum 3 times. And mostly they were voluntary. Giving was voluntary. We have the institutionalization of zakat in Medinan period. We have the whole notion of rights coming in within the Medinan period. The rights of man, women, children, the rights of divorce, the nafaqah, provisions for women, inheritance. Can you talk us through the Medinan periods and the formulation of the system of rights and the institutionalization of zakat and so on and so forth? Dr. Imran, you're on mute.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, I'll maybe just pick up on 2 examples that you mentioned. So you talked about the Medinan period as specifying the rights and institutionalizing some of the rituals and practices. Maybe I can give 2 examples. The change of the Qibla from Bayt al-Muqaddas to Masjid al-Haram in Makkah indicated a change of identity. So maybe to answer your question as to why this change occurred and what implications it had, it meant that perhaps the reason for this institutionalization was to create a different identity from the fellow Jews and Christians existing at that time. And that's why perhaps there were these differences, because if everything was too assimilated, we would not be able to tell the difference between what practices the Muslims were doing, how their zakat, how their charity giving was different to the other groups in the society. 2, when it came to nafaqah, for example, there was a very specific provisions in relation to taking care of women. So in the verses that we have in the Quran, it clearly says, let the man take care of the women, for example, or when the mother is suckling in another verse, then the father must make sure that there are provisions for the mother, etc. But Allah says there should not be any hardship for the father as well, and the husband here. So it seems that in running the society, more rights were established based on the scenarios presented to our beloved Prophet, peace be upon him, to the extent that in the ahadith that we have, for example, in Wasail al-Shia, for example, or in Lumma Dimashqiyya, very specific provisions are even instituted, like, for example, giving 2 pieces of clothing to the woman in the summer and 2 in the winter, or making sure that oil and vinegar is bought for the woman. So maybe just to simplify the matter is, one is the institutionalization of rituals as well as specific laws established a different, specific and unique identity for Muslims as opposed to the existing religious groups of the time. 2, as in your example that you mentioned about nafaqah, which I've just elaborated on, that nafaqah is a very prime example that within the context, the man was commanded to provide according to the customs, the urf, and the scenario of the time. I'm not sure what else to add, except I've given detail to what you've said.
So then I would like to ask, in addition to this, would you then say that the formulations that occurred within Medina were directly in line with the essence? So if we say that the essential teachings were that we become godly, God-centered, that we become virtuous people, that we become moral, we become conscientious being, then the Medinian phase was only formulating that essence within a societal context. Would you say then that would be true to say about the Prophet, that this is what he endeavored to do, formulate the essence in accordance with the context?
In my small judgment, yes, I would agree with that, Sheikh. Yes. based on the examples I've given. As you know better than me, and mashallah, all these scholars know better, is that even the specification of giving, as example, 2 items of clothing, one in the summer, one in the winter, to the woman, is simply an expression of the essence of taking care of the woman, because the man was the breadwinner, and making sure that her rights were respected as opposed to ignored.
The fundamental concern of the Prophet was the creation of a virtuous, godly society.
Yes.
That was the fundamental, yeah?
Yes, I agree. I agree with that. Yes.
Mission of the Prophet.
Yes.
Dr. Majabin, then I would like to come to you after that. Would you say that the whole of this process of the Prophet imparting Islam and the prophetic missionary role was an evolutionary one, in the sense that he brought about this awakening within Mecca? He emphasized to their minds that something is wrong. You have a greater calling. And then slowly, gradually, he begins to institutionalize rights, systems of rights, of care, so on and so forth, in line with the essence. And this was very steadily done, progressively done, until it culminates in a full-fledged state of religion operating within a human community. Would you say it was an evolutionary process and a gradual one?
Well, I'm going to say that it was a strategic one. So it was not something that was haphazard. I think it was very strategic and very beautifully organized. And I'm saying this because I've always sort of studied the prophetic pedagogy from that verse in Surah Jummah, which talks about the role of the Prophet. And, بَعَثَ اللَّهُ فِي الْأُمِّيِّينَ رَسُولًا مِّنْهُمْ يَتْلُو عَلَيْهِمْ آيَاتِهِ وَيُزَكِّيهِمْ. That is the one that we talk about. And from that verse, I've understood 4 different stages how the Prophet built this transition from Mecca to Medina. And I'm not quite sure if I can call it evolutionary, but I know that I can absolutely see the strategizing within that system. And also, I'm going to just sort of, highlight the part that Dr. Panjwani said about a system that was sort of making a distinction between the Judaism and the Christian practices that were already in core, to sort of give an identity to something that was different from that. Just to sort of clarify that, I think he began in Mecca with the first stage in his strategy, which is from the Surah of Jum'ah, where he was unforming the norms of the society. So the questions that he was posing, the critique that he was introducing, was calling for an unformation, so to speak, removing what people thought was a form or a norm of their lives. So he was questioning that and breaking it all up. And while he was breaking it up, I think he was very cognizant of the work that we scholars do, right? There is just one truth. And as Muslims, we believe that that is the same truth that started emanating from the first Prophet Adam to the Khatam, alayhi afdalu salatu wassalam. So when we had this, what is happening is that the light just comes through from a clear window. But because of life and because of different ideas, you find the window gets smoky, it gets dusty. So every reformer of their time essentially tries to clear that dust away and lets the light do its work. And once the dust is clean, the light will just shine through. So with this critique process and this uninforming process, the Prophet was just trying to let the light that had emanated long before he arrived to just shine through. So unforming the norms was the strategy that he started with. And after that came the يُعَلِّمَهُمُ الْكِتَابَ وَالْحِكْمَةِ. So he then added information. Once you destroy everything, you need to have something that goes on top of it. So then the next process was informing them that goodness within them that they felt, the morality that they felt was God indeed from all this time. And he never really went anywhere or didn't need a sort of a reintroduction into their life. So with the unforming began the informing, then giving them the right kind of information. And when that right kind of information found a place in their hearts and their minds, and hopefully in their logic and their conviction, they were now ready for a reform. They could put those things together. And when that reformation led to a transformation, when they're now coming into Medina, now there needed to give an identity, a name, a face to what they believed in. And then that face became the Sunnah of the Prophet, and that name became the Sharia, which starts to get formulated to give an identity to the new people. So I don't really think it was something that was designed to keep itself away from the Christians or the Jewish tradition, but I think it was the same truth that had shown from before, and it was just a reminder, because we know again from the Quran that maybe the other theistic religions had sort of polluted those rules that were already in place. So I think that's how it went. It was strategic, if maybe not evolutionary all the way.
So I'll pick up on that verse that you just cited. It is obviously from Surah Jummah. It's a Madinian surah. هو الذي بعث في الأميين رسولا منهم يتلو عليهم آياته ويزكيهم ويعلمهم الكتاب والحكمة. Now, Dr. Ayman, by looking at the life of the Prophet and looking at the Quran says to the Blessed Prophet, مَا كُنْتَ تَدْرِي مَا الْإِيمَانُ وَلَا الْكِتَابُ. You did not know what was Iman, you did not know what was Kitab. It's saying through the Prophet Muhammad, you did not know these things until we taught them to you. And on so many occasions we see in the Quran that the Prophet informs us that, look, إِنْ أَتَّبِعُ إِلَّا مَا يُوحَى إِلَيَّ. I merely follow what is being revealed to me. So obviously I take on board the point that Dr. Mahjabin is saying, that he was very strategical. But did he of necessity know in Makkah that he will move to Medina, and subsequently what he will achieve in Medina? Because the verse of the Quran says again and again, the verse is, إِمَّا نُرِيَنَّكَ بَعْضَ مَا نَعِدُهُمْ أَوْ نَتَبَفَّيَنَّكَ مِنْ قَبْلِ. The Quran was not giving the Prophet any guarantee that we will keep you alive till the next day. We might show you some of what we have promised to do to them, or we may just take you before that. This is what the Quran is saying to the Prophet. So the Prophet can strategize in a particular battle, but the Prophet cannot strategize the whole missionary role when the Quran is saying you do not know what is coming. We might even kill you before that. So Dr. Ayman, in line with what Dr. Mahjabin has stated of the verse, was the Prophet simply placed on an evolutionary track himself? Basically, he was put on a progressive track. Like, for example, you see this in the Quran. In Surah Baqarah, which was revealed first in Medina, يَسَلُونَكَ عَنِ الْخَمْرِ وَالْمَيْسَرِ. They ask you about Khamr and Maysar. Say there is good in there, but the detriment is far worse. Then, once you get the establishment of the Muslim community in Al-Imran, again, you have reference to Khamr and Maysar, that Shaitan is causing adawata wal baghda fil khamri wal maysar. And finally, فَهَلْ أَنْتُمْ مُنْتَهُونَ, a very stern tone comes in. فَهَلْ أَنْتُمْ مُنْتَهُونَ. Can we say here that it was progressive as the people were getting ready to achieve a greater state of binding to God? That greater state was being given to them. Previously, they could not, because as Dr. Mahjabin pointed out, the first thing was to awaken them, ayatullah, وَيُزَكِّيهِمْ, and then to cleanse them of the ills of idolatry, superstition, worship of the ego. Then يُعَلِّمُهُمُ الْكِتَابِ, then teach them, وَالْحِكْمَةِ, and then give them that broad vision. So Dr. Ayman, would you say that this whole process of the Prophet and giving of Islam was a progressive process?
I would say so, for a lot of reasons. I would say that the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ was put on track rather than putting the strategy himself. Why I would say that is, as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala again in Quran said it so many times, that He is giving the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ the teaching that would lead him to the right way. And that was from the very beginning. Once he received the revelation, going to Sayyida Khadija radiallahu anha in shock, right? Not knowing what he is supposed to do at that moment, like what is he going to do with these verses that were revealed to him. Sayyida Khadija bringing Waraq ibn Nawfal, like, and he talks the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam that he's the last prophet and messenger, introduces, like giving some interpretation to what he just witnessed. And then the revelation of Quran keeps coming, giving him guidance to this. And once the people are ready for something, Quran comes and lays the foundation for it and takes them forward, and then another step forward, and that goes like this. It was progressive because the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, during his time in Mecca, when the companions wanted to do the hijrah, the first hijrah, yes, to Al-Habasha, he didn't take part because he wasn't given the permission, even though he knew previously, from the time he received the prophecy, when Waraq ibn Nawfal said to him that you will be fought and your people are going to kick you out of this beloved city. That's from the first moment, but he never knew when and to which city. So he was waiting for the orders from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to carry on. I would say the progression took place because Quran and the revelation put like a clear distinction between Islam and Iman. Going back to the point that we mentioned at the beginning, Iman as a foundation and it with all its articles was laid during the time in Mecca. It was laid down during the time in Mecca with all its articles. تؤمن بالله وملائكته وكتبه ورسله واليوم الآخر والقدر. The purification of the soul, the heart, the belief system. All of this, when the companions and the people were ready, then it progressed further. So they were ready, then moving to Medina, making brothers between Al-Muhajirin and Ansar. The soul is ready. Yes, I'm going to give you half of what I have. The people from Al-Ansar did. All right, comes second year after Hijrah to Medina, comes the Psalm of Ramadan. People are ready. يا أيها الذين آمنوا كتب عليكم الصيام كما كتب على الذين من قبلكم. They are ready because Siyam has been ordained as it was ordained on the people before, and you've learned about this in Mecca, that the people of Al-Kitab, they had Siyam. So the system, the soul, the heart, everything is ready. It progress. Okay, it's time for you to act. Comes the Prophet ﷺ meets with the people from the Jews, fasting the day of Ashura. And then asking them, they say, oh, this is the day Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala saved the Prophet Musa. All right, that has already been laid out in Mecca. Sayyidina Musa, and he's our prophet like Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, and. So it's time right now. All right, so Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam fasts the day of Ashura, and the day afterwards comes the Jews asking the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam questions in Mecca about the system belief. And they ask him, and the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam answers, and they know only a prophet can answer their questions. But at the end, they ask him, they say to him, who delivers the revelation to you? He says, Jibreel. He says, no, we hate Jibreel. If it was Mikael, we would follow you. Then Quran comes because the people are ready. Man kana aduwan lillahi wa malaikatihi, and then talks about Jibreel wa Mikael, because it has already been introduced during the Mecca. So yes, like wholeheartedly, I would say it was very progressive. A step leading to the one afterwards. The Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam was put on track through the revelation, and once people were ready, Quran came down to take them to the next step.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ayman. So we see two things, that the essence that was given. Oh, by the way, we welcome our dear sister, Dr. Rebecca Masterton, who has joined us now. Dr. Rebecca, I'll come to you in just a little while so you can hear the conversation as it takes place, and you'll be in the perspective, and hopefully we can take it from there. So we see that the Meccan teachings were essential teachings based on the essence of purity, unity, on accountability, on care of the other. In Medina, the Prophet did strategize. He did see how best to introduce the system of Islam, give them identity, how to institutionalize. But at the same time, from the Quran, we see that it is quite obvious that the community was progressing, evolving. The Blessed Prophet himself was put on an evolutionary track in the sense of his own personal experience, what he himself was understanding, and how he was formulating that beautiful essence, the Meccan essence, for the people in Medina and creating an ummah. With that, now I would like us to move to the next particular point that we want to discuss. What do you say, therefore, of the verse Al-Yawm akmaltu lakum dinakum wa atmamtu alaykum ni'mati wa raditu lakum Islam dina? Now this comes towards the end of the revelatory era, that today I have completed your deen for you, if that means religion, and conferred my favors upon you, and I'm pleased for Islam to be your religion. Dr. Imran, what does completion of deen mean in that case? If the whole process was an evolutionary one to an extent, of course, if it was a strategical one, then Islam is absolutely complete. But if it was a progressive one, then what does this verse mean?
Jazakallah. I think to answer that, I'm just recalling some points of tafsir in relation to deen, which is mentioned in the Quran. So, for example, in Surah Saf, it is mentioned as Deenul Haq, okay, religion of truth. Or as some of our Mufassirun, like Allama Tabatabai, mentioned Deenul Wahid. And every time that I read verses like the one that you've just said, it appears to point to the essence of the faith in two ways, which is the reality of God. So in terms of the completion of religion, it is the reality of the one God as opposed to any other supposed realities that may have existed or perceived to exist, whether it is idols or whether it is something else. So one is the establishment of the reality of God. That's the first part. And in the tafsir of Surah Al-Alaq, this is also mentioned. It was the fact that they did believe in Allah as one of their gods who may have created, but Allah did not have the power to regulate. So the completion is the refinement of their belief. And two is the refinement of their morals, which Dr. Ayman and Sister Mahajibin also discussed. The fact that they were now in a position to be able to respect each other with a sense of dignity and honor, whether woman, whether orphan. And so that completion, therefore, gave them a foundation to then proceed with their life, because Prophet is going to pass away. So they've got the principles now to be able to develop a society based on the core principles that our beloved Prophet left, which then means that today, as Muslims, maybe we can ask is the completion of those principles, whether we are giving them effect to their essence, as in the examples that you mentioned, like nafaka or other examples, whether indeed in all of these principles or fiqh rules that we have derived, whether we are going back to Deenul Haq based on the refinement of our belief in God and the morals which the Prophet laid.
Thank you, Dr. Imran. Dr. Rebecca, Dr. Imran is saying that the completion of deen meant that the Prophet had delivered the principles of faith, not necessarily the formulations of those principles. And what I understand from him is that what he is saying is that if the human community changes in the mode of its existence, then those principles can be reformulated beyond the prophetic era. But we do know that the spiritual identity given by the Prophet was complete. Pray 5 times, fast, perform Hajj, there is zakat. And then again, if we were to talk about the discourse on human rights, the Prophet came and gave rights to man and to women, so on and so forth. What Dr. Imran is saying here is that this was all in a state of flux, or he may mean some of it is in a state of flux. I would like to take your thoughts on this, and also to say that after that verse, the Quran was still being revealed upon the Blessed Prophet. The revelation of the Quran hadn't come to an end. But I do feel that the ahkam of Islam and ahkam of Quran had ceased to be revealed. But the verses of the Quran were still being revealed subsequent to this particular verse. Bear in mind that the Quran did not abolish slavery, it initiated the trend for the liberation of slaves, but it did not abolish slavery. Just keeping that in mind, how do you understand the verse, "Today I have completed your faith," and what Dr. Panjwani has said about completion of principles, but not necessarily the formulations?
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Allahumma salli ala Muhammadin wa ali Muhammad. Apologies for lateness. There's an interesting narration in Al-Kafi where someone comes to Imam al-Sadiq alayhi salam and says, I heard that when the Holy Prophet, peace be upon him, his holy progeny, was passing away, he revealed to Ali ibn Abi Talib alayhi salam 1,000 gates of knowledge. Is that true or not? And Imam Sadiq alayhi salam said, I mean, you may be familiar with this anyway, it was 1,000 gates of knowledge, and through each one of those gates was another 1,000 gates of knowledge. And then the man says to Imam Sadiq alayhi salam, so how many of those gates have been opened or revealed to the Shia? And Imam Sadiq alayhi salam said, not even 2. So I take this revelation from the Quran about the completion of the deen to mean that in one sense, everything that was necessary for humanity was revealed. But of course, whether mankind has the capacity for imbibing the message is another issue. So it seems that when we look at a lot of the narrations from the Imams who came afterwards, you know, I mean, they were getting into fiqh discussions and theological discussions. In fact, I was talking about this just the other night. Fiqh discussions, theological discussions, I mean, many issues were arising which led to the recording of conversations that have been compiled in the hadith collections. Conversations that may not have taken place during the lifetime of the Holy Prophet, but we, you know, a lot of it we actually don't know. One issue is that in both Sunni and Shi'i traditions, there are very few early extant texts that can be carbon dated to the lifetime of the Holy Prophet, or even to, you know, the subsequent 25 years after that, 30 years after that. So that means that in both Sunni and Shi'i traditions, we are relying on narrators who, you know, who began to compile texts depending upon chains of narration that really started to solidify, we could say, prior to the life of Imam Sadiq alayhi salam, maybe during the lifetime of Imam Sajjad alayhi salam. So number one, we can have these debates about, or discussions about, what we think, as an example, this verse of the Holy Quran means, and we can have our different theories about it. At the end of the day, they're going to remain as theories because, number one, we don't have, as I said, early extant texts that can be carbon dated from that time. Another issue is that in those texts that we do have, particularly let's look at the Shi'i tradition, the emphasis is upon how, and it again depends on the definition of knowledge, but the emphasis is upon how the Muslims were not ready to receive the knowledge that would have benefited them. Another thing is that I think it is from Imam Baqir alayhi salam, again in Al-Kafi, where he says that if the Muslims, let's say if the Shia, and that's a very loose term as well, we know back then what is the definition of a Shia, it was perhaps different from what it is today. Let's say if the lovers of the Ahlul Bayt or whoever the Shia were, if they had managed to keep their mouths closed, if they had proven themselves to be trustworthy in the way that they conduct themselves and in the way that they learn this knowledge and transmit this knowledge, then everything would have been brought out into the open and made available to, you know, humanity. So we have this issue of, I suppose, an idea or an idea rather than a concept, but an idea that actually we are still in a state of potentiality. So this is why we have both in Sunni and Shia traditions this idea of the coming of the Mahdi alayhi salam, that actually we are not really going to see the proper manifestation of the Deen of Islam until you know, the appearance of Imam Mahdi alayhi salam.
I'll take it forward from what you have said. I just need to bring one point in. Dr. Ayman, and I'm going to come back to you, Dr. Rebecca. Dr. Ayman, can we make a distinction, a fundamental distinction, and obviously this distinction has been spoken of and has already been made, between ibadat and muamalat? Ibadat being the spiritual identity, what constitutes to the spiritual identity, like salat, maybe siyam, hajj, and muamalat, that is to do with general interactions, the laws of marriage, divorce, and even to the extent of the appropriation of the portions of zakat in different places, or even the percentage of levy and tax that we have to give. Can we make that distinction and say at this point here that the ibadat maybe are the completion of faith, together with that essence of God-centricity, refinement of the soul, becoming virtuous, but the muamalat are open to interpretation and they are not complete in that way. The Quran merely, in a pragmatic way, gave them their forms befitting the society of the Prophet very quickly. But for example, things like the shares of men and women in inheritance, depending on how much they are contributing to the household, or for example, the right of divorce for women, or for example, abolishment of slavery and concubinage. These are the things that were always on the move if we admit to a progressive and an evolutionary system. But very quickly, because I want to go around the...
Yeah, of course. I mean, like, you know, we had, like, as I said, the whole Mecca was about the Iman, and then Medina was about the pillars of Islam, aside, like, you know, aside from Shahada, Salah, Zakah, Sawm, Hajj, etc. And the muamalat, the system for it. So the religion, when it comes to ibadah, it was completed 100%. That's the way. Like, that's why the Prophet ﷺ, when he was asked about an action, he says, like, you know, for salah, sallu kama ra'aytumuni usalli. Even the things that were not revealed in Quran, or the details that were not there, the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, as like all his actions and sayings are wahy from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So that was completed. Let's say the part of muamalat, and let's say even hudud, there were things like, you know, in Islam, for example, for hudud, we have like al-qisas and the hudud that are established, but then you have a ta'zir that is left up to the judge or the ruler, the system that as you see fit for the society. So the foundation for this and the principle were put there, and then the Muslim, based on this, they can take it forward. One clear example of that is when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about what's halal and haram. We've got loads of verses, this is halal, this is haram, for this, for that. But then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala puts the principle that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala made halal everything that is tayyib, that is good for us, and made haram everything that is bad for us. So that sets the principle for the Muslim to take it forward. After the message is already completed, there will be issues like based on society or like, you know, in different places. And then we would have to, what we have, like, you know, in fiqh, for example, when we have al-qiyas, analogy. So so Islam put the principle even for such a thing. So ibadat were complete. Yeah, the main hudud were completed. But the part about mu'amalat or the issues that may arise, the foundation was put for the Muslim to take it forward afterwards as they see fit, but because the principle is there.
So thank you, Dr. Ayman. I'm going to go through all of our panelists with this particular question very, very quickly, because there's a very important question that still needs to be addressed. Dr. Mahjabeen, what are your thoughts on the same issue? Would you say that, let's say, the hudud that Dr. Ayman spoke of, the punishments, we would still be cutting the hands of a thief? Or do you think there is an essence behind it of protection of society, reformation of the individual, so on and so forth, which can be taken into consideration, and instead of maybe cutting the hand, other penalties can be applied to achieve the same end?
So I think we're just following up from that first verse that you asked us to reflect upon, and that is Al-Yawma Akmaltu Lakum Dinakum. What part of it was common and what part of it is open to sort of further development. So I think I would concentrate on understanding what really the word deen means before we try and understand what really was completed that day, or what is, you know, suggested that was completed that day. So what really does deen mean? And I think it would be safe to say, or at least a safe place to start our discussion from, was that it was a set of values or a set of foundational values, which I think just continued, like I believe, from Adam, and needed a kind of reinforcing with each prophet. And with the wilaya put in place that day, which I think most interpreters read it as the last Hajj, or the time for the announcement of the wilaya. What happened, I believe, is that the foundations were locked in, the primary sources were locked in, a methodology was set in place, and then humanity was left with this core source to then develop the needs of their society. So it would be very difficult to say that mu'amalat were decided and locked in that day, only because mu'amalat happen. They just happen. Life didn't stop in the 7th century. Life went on to the 8th, to the 9th, to the 21st century that we are in. So we can't really say that mu'amalat were done with that time, because they're still continuing to evolve as human experiences evolve. But what was set in place, I believe, is our understanding of deen and what deen means to us. If it is a set of foundational beliefs, then that was, you know, put in and set in place and completed. If it was a methodology, that was completed. If there were primary sources like the Quran and the Ahl Bayt, or the Quran and the Wilaya, that were set in place, and then giving people enough tools to apply to their mu'amalat in their situations and stay close to the foundations that were set in. So I believe that is what happened, and hudud and things like that will keep on evolving.
No, thank you, Dr. Mahjabeen. So, Dr. Rebecca, I'm coming back to you, and Dr. Imran, I'll come to you after Dr. Rebecca. So, when we say that the Prophet transformed his community through his preaching, he shifted the whole paradigm. Would it therefore be true to say that subsequent to the Prophet, in every era, in order for the community to be a transformed, virtuous community, they would need to re-envisage the principles of deen, as Dr. Majabin has said, within their own context and how best to fit them in their own context. Would you agree with that, or what are your thoughts on that? Very quickly, please.
I think we can talk about principles, but I think what Islam, what the Quran addresses is human character and human nature and human tendencies. So Islam, Islam has not manifested as it should do up to now, as we know right from the beginning, because of the human tendency for despotism and greed and tyranny and short-sightedness and violence, the desire for violence as a way of getting people's their own way. So you can have principles, but for me, I mean, we need the reformation of how a human being actually thinks and behaves. And actually, manages to rein in this desire to crush the other, to have your way. So, and up to now, human nature hasn't changed. I mean, this is what the Quran says, that we've got this whole history of humanity. Each new generation that comes along does the same thing. So I would say that for a society to be transformed, we need to look at how we are going to change within ourselves.
That's a very interesting take. Okay, leading on from that, the Quran does say "Kuntum khayra ummatin ukhrijat linnas," whereas previously it said "Kuntum ala shafa hufratin minan nar." You are on the verge of falling into the pits of hell. And afterwards in the Medinan Surah, it condones the community and says, "Kuntum khayra ummatin ukhrijat linnas." So that just shows that progressive trend and the change in nature of at least those people. God acknowledges that they are far more refined than what they were. They were barbaric previously, and now they are fine-tuned humans, at least that particular community. So that does hint at the change in human nature in a progressive manner. And of course, we can discuss it at some other point. I just wanted to point that out. It might have been a momentary thing. We need to discuss that further. Now, building on all that we have stated right now in the last hour, that the Blessed Prophet supplied us with fundamentals, foundational principles. He made his community God-centric. He made them accountable, conscientious beings. He instilled within them the worth of a virtuous human existence, taking care of the rights of others and being moral creatures. He then formulated those moral values within the societal context. Coming to the present day, what are your thoughts on the current situation that we find amongst the Muslims and the law of blasphemy and our reaction to blasphemy? And this is my final question. I would like to start with Imran Panjwani. Now, I'll just give you some context and some perspective on this matter. The Quran does not say anything about blasphemy or the punishment of blasphemy. It talks about blasphemy, istihza, when you hear that the verses of the Quran are being mocked, then stand away from them, O Muhammad. When they engage in another conversation, when they stop mocking at God and the verses, then go back and sit with them and enjoy their company. There's no talk about any form of punishment. There are 3 incidences in the lifetime of the Prophet, and Dr. Ayman can come in here as well. 2 of them we know were authentic, in which the Prophet just pardoned those people who are abusing him. There is one that is not very authentic, in which we hear that one of the Sahabi went and killed the blasphemer. Now, the way in which we reacted to what happened in France, for example, or previous to that, is that a befitting reaction that the Muslims are offering? Dr. Majabin said the Prophet was very strategical. Now, obviously, by his very nature, he was a godly person. A godly person is expected to forgive and forego and pardon in order to win over the antagonist. But when we react in a bitter manner, we reinforce the sense of intolerance of Islam within an already misinformed mind. And of course, it just gives fuel to Islamophobia. Dr. Panjwani, I'll start with you on this one. What are your thoughts on the law of blasphemy and the way in which we are reacting to the situation? Very quickly, and of course you can talk about maybe trying to balance of freedom of speech and the right to offend. You're on mute.
Sorry. Okay, two things. Jazakallah Shaykh. The depiction of our beloved Prophet through barbaric cartoons or indecent cartoons is nothing new. It's been happening since 7th century, since Saint John Damascene, for example, accused Islam and the Prophet, for example, of being false. And then in Andalusia, you have a lot of paintings of the Prophet as a licentious Arab, and then these were inflamed further by the Crusades. So one is, this is not a new event, and I think we should appreciate that, because it also goes back to how the Prophet and those early communities reacted to these things. Two, as to answer that particular point, how did the Prophet react and how should we react? In Surah Al-Muzammil, there is a beautiful verse, verse 10. Allah says, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, وَاصْبِرْ عَلَى مَا يَقُولُونَ وَاهْجُرْهُمْ هَجْرًا جَمِيلًا. And be patient over what they say and keep away from them in a graceful manner. This is, of course, in the tafasir in reference to the mushrikun and the kuffar who are accusing the Prophet of being false, of being majnoon, of doing sihrun mubin, clear magic. And then Allah says, leave me to deal with the deniers, the opulent, and give them a little respite. And when I was reflecting on this incident which happened in France, I feel that yes, any person has a right to express anything. But the person who expresses must be sensitive to whether it is a Muslim, whether it is a family, a father, a mother, anything that they are depicting cannot be abusive because it's going to offend. And I think that those people in France that draw such cartoons, I think there has to be a respect for the material that they're drawing that is going to offend. On our side, and to directly answer Sheikh's question, I think that we do not take heed of the Quran. As to how we should behave, I think the Quran is very clear that we should be patient, we keep a distance, we behave with them gracefully, meaning that we are able to engage in dialogue or jadal and these sorts of things, to be able to argue against these things, but not to react and be violent. Because this is exactly things that the Prophet was stopping in the society that he came on. So I think that any violent reaction is unjustified, but freedom of expression as a principle should be respected. But as with any principle, it has boundaries, and those boundaries mean respecting the sensitivities of who we are addressing.
Thank you. Dr. Ayman, just very, very quickly, if you could just address the issue of the law of blasphemy within the Sharia very quickly.
All right. So, to be honest, there isn't a law, there isn't a had. Yeah, because looking at quickly 2 verses in Quran. So the verse that you yourself mentioned, Sheikh Arif, that's verse, famous verse in Surah An-Nisa, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَقَدْ نَزَّلَ عَلَيْكُمْ فِي الْكِتَابِ أَنْ إِذَا سَمِعْتُمْ آيَاتِ اللَّهِ يُكْفَرُ بِهَا وَيُسْتَهْزَأْ بِهَا فَلَا تَقْعُدُوا مَعَهُمْ. Do not sit with them حَتَّى يَخُوضُوا فِي حَدِيثٍ غَيْرِهِ. So you mentioned the verse where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said to Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, and here Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, if people do this, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, do this to them or do that. He said, فَلَا تَقْعُدُوا مَعَهُمْ حَتَّى يَخُوضُوا, till they just change the subject. إِنَّكُمْ إِذًا مِثْلُهُمْ, because if you sit with them, you are encouraging them. All right. And then the other verse in Surah At-Tawbah, which is very clear on this. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَلَئِن سَأَلْتَهُمْ لَيَقُولُنَّ إِنَّمَا كُنَّا نَخُوضُ وَنَلْعَبُ قُلْ أَبِاللَّهِ وَآيَاتِهِ وَرَسُولِهِ كُنْتُمْ تَسْتَهْزِئُونَ. So the blasphemy, Allah, his verses, Quran, وَرَسُولِهِ, the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, clear cut here. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, لا تعتذروا. Good? قَدْ كَفَرْتُمْ بَعْدَ إِيمَانِكُمْ. So the hukm comes from Allah. But then what happens? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, إِن نَعْفُ عَنْ طَائِفَةٍ مِّنْكُمْ. So Allah says, قَدْ كَفَرْتُمْ بَعْدَ إِيمَانِكُمْ. But then says, إِن نَعْفُ عَنْ طَائِفَةٍ مِّنْكُمْ نُعَذِّبُ طَائِفَةً بِأَنَّهُمْ كَانُوا مُجْرِمِينَ. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that the iqab, the punishment is going to be in the hereafter. We may forgive some, and the others we will give punishment like Allah knows best. So from Quran and the verse that talk about blasphemy, there isn't a had for this in Islam. If we talk about the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam response to blasphemy at his time, that like the subject is going to take longer, but I just like and like how forgiving the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam was, how many times the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam gave those opportunities. You're talking about blasphemy, talk about the people of At-Ta'if. The Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam goes to them, right? And then he invites them to the message of Islam. Not only blasphemy, like, the head of the tribe says to him, hasn't your Lord found someone else to send, so he sent you? So emotional and physical harm. And then at the end, the angel comes to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam and he says, no, maybe one day Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will make one of their descendants, so not even them themselves, so they may remain as this, but the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam is hoping that one of their descendants afterwards may believe in the message of Islam. So to be honest, there isn't that much of a debate about that if we look at the main sources of Sharia.
Thank you, Dr. Raymond. Dr. Majabin, the Quran ordains us to follow the prime example of Prophet Muhammad. لَقَدْ كَانَ لَكُمْ فِي رَسُولِ اللَّهِ أُسْوَةٌ حَسَنَةٌ لِمَنْ كَانَ يَرْجُو اللَّهَ وَالْيَوْمَ الْآخِرَ وَذَكَرَ اللَّهَ كَثِيرًا. How do you think the Blessed Prophet would react to his antagonists, especially people depicting him in an indecent manner, let's say within a caricature or a cartoon, very quickly?
Thank you. I think very quickly the Prophet would not react. I just think that language is not synonymous with the kind of personality that we're talking about here. So I don't think he would be one to react. Like the verse says, he would probably go back and think about it. He would respond to it, but I don't think a reaction is ever the best way to sort of to react is not the best way to engage with a certain incident, especially the incident that you're making reference to. Again, free speech is also a very intrinsic and important part of a just society, but as long as the free speech is a respectful speech. So I think that is another thing that we learn from the Uswa Hasana of the Prophet, the morality of the Prophet, that if he were to speak or address something, then it would be respectful speech. So free speech is very nice as long as it is a respectful speech. And then thirdly, I think I'd like to say what we hear from the verse that you've just enlightened for us and the context of our discussion is that we also need to keep in mind the hierarchy. Who are we talking about? So if somebody is abusing me to my face, then I would learn from the prophetic moral and be forgiving towards that person. So do we have examples of where people were abusing the Prophet to his face? And then how did he respond to that? Were they abusing God to his face? Now that's another level of a hierarchy, because that is someone who is dear to the Prophet. And how did he respond to that kind of a situation? And in both situations, we see that he is not reactionary. And violence was never his way. So he did take a step back and he did respond, and we responded to them in the best manners. So I think for very shortly to say is reaction would not be his style, would not be his uswa. Respect would be his uswa. And then, of course, coming back with a strategic response would be his uswa. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Dr. Rebecca, following on from that, and this is my last question and the last comment that we will take, how best can the Muslim community now, in line with what Dr. Majabin has said, reflect the character of the Prophet in response to what is happening in France or elsewhere where people are demeaning the Prophet? You're on mute.
I think that I was just talking about this tonight, where I was earlier before I came here, and I think that to be honest, we need to take a step back from this discussion, because this discussion about how Muslims should react is itself a kind of reaction to what has happened. And I was discussing with a journalist tonight about we need to observe the wider context in which this has taken place. We need to be aware of the kind of hidden agendas and the strategies that are being taken as part of, you know, this campaign that's been taking place, well, I mean, for decades and decades in the Muslim world, and in that sense, if Muslim leaders could guide their followers and their listeners on being able to combat the pressing issues of basically, you know, having the whole Muslim world smashed up, destroyed, oil taken, the sheer levels of corruption. I mean, there's just so much that needs to be dealt with. We have this web, this network of interests and operations that are taking place between Europe and, you know, the Muslim world. So we need to actually examine what lies behind you know, this supposed attempted provocation. As I said tonight on a discussion earlier, the killer of that teacher was Chechen. The Chechens were in large numbers going in to Syria, you know, to join these forces of Daesh. So the question is like, what was a Chechen doing in France? How did he end up in France? That's the question. They say he was in prison. They say that he had reformed, and that's why he was let out of prison. But you know, I think that we read the news, we see events, and we kind of swallow a narrative that's being given to us without seeing the games that are being played behind it. And in order to really formulate a smarter response to these kinds of things that are going on, we need to understand these, you know, like I said, the agendas and the strategies that are lying behind this. And it's all part of a wider campaign of subjugating the Muslim world in order to take its resources, as has been going on for decades.
Thank you for that. We have run out of time, unfortunately. Such engaging discussions. I would like to thank all of you for taking the time out, for sharing such valuable thoughts, for giving us so much information and food for thought. I would like to remind us that we all belong to the Blessed Prophet as a Muslim Ummah, whether we are Sunnis or Shias or Salafis or Deobandis or Brahilwis or Ismailis or Bohra. We are all underneath the umbrella of the Ummah of the Blessed Prophet Muhammad. And the Blessed Prophet Muhammad obviously called on to the Abrahamic faiths as well to unite with him in the name of the worship of one God. This man inspires us. 1400 years after he lived, he inspires us into godliness, into virtue, into goodness, to never give up as he never gave up, to see good within the human community, to try and cultivate that good within ourselves and allowing others to become good as well, and lead our community and humanity at large as one family towards a state of virtuous existence. With that, I will say once again, Eid Mubarak to one and all, and until we meet again, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Please stay on, panelists.